It's perhaps pretty normal to us now, having seen it in every Ironman outing of the last 15 years. But back in 2008,
having to figure out how to film Tony Stark inside the helmet of his Iron Man suit was an absolute nightmare to do. Because the VFX artist working on it had the impossible task of making us believe that in the tiny gap between Tony's face and the front of his helmet, that he's got this full heads-up display that he can see and control with absolutely no problems. So how did they pull this off? What filmmaking and VFX techniques did they use so that our brains wouldn't immediately reject this weird and experimental piece of filmmaking? Well, HUD all up as we dive into the fascinating story behind how one VFX studio created this impossible piece of cinematography that had a longevity across the entire MCU's runtime. So when looking at this, the first question you've got to ask is, if these shots are so complicated, then why are they even in the movie in the first place?
Well, this all comes down to the one question that plagues anyone who sets out to create a superhero movie, and that is, how can we see our actor behind the superhero's mask? Because the human face is capable of portraying millions of tiny little emotions, and a talented actor can use these emotions to completely guide the tone of a scene, or open up a deeper level to their character and to the story. So if this face then gets concealed behind a mask, then you suddenly cut your audiences off from a critical avenue of communication that they once had with the movie. And this creates a massive problem for superhero movies, where you kinda have to conceal their face at times. It's a mainstay of a lot of comic book characters that they adorn masks, be it either for secrecy or protection. And if you start to mess with this avenue of their personality, then you begin to break down the DNA of what makes them a character. And so when it came to both the character and the production of Iron Man, things were no different. We as audiences want to see Iron Man's actor, Robert Downey Jr.,
breathing life into the character.
but we also want to see him in the full Iron Man suit, believably and logically protecting his face as he maneuvers through war zones and stuff. So for the film to work, they had to devise a solution to this problem. They had to find a way for audiences to be able to see Tony's face inside of the helmet, but still have him keep his helmet on. Now, we as modern audiences obviously know what they did to resolve this problem. But back in 2009, this was a seemingly impossible question to answer, because no one had ever seen this now famous in-helmet Iron Man HUD technique before. And this meant that it wasn't immediately obvious to the filmmakers and the VFX artists as to how to actually do this. So, in search of answers, they looked to what made Iron Man different from other superheroes, and they began to wonder if they could somehow leverage his technical edge to create something truly unique. And this is how the now iconic in-helmet shot was first conceived. They weren't sure exactly what they could do, but they knew there was something that they could achieve via a blend of Tony, his AI Jarvis, and his futuristic tech. And with this, they found themselves drawn to this scene from 2001, A Space Odyssey, where the astronaut Dave has the reflection of the computer's lights arcing across the curved design of his helmet. The camera is in tight and close, and the lights, in part, conceal his face. But they did so in a way where we're still able to interpret every emotion and feeling that Dave portrays. And for the filmmakers, they knew that this was exactly what they were looking for. By emulating this, they knew that they too could have the camera tight on Tony's face to symbolize him being inside of the helmet. And then, to not make this shot too jarring for the audience, they could reference the lights from 2001 and build a heads-up display, or HUD, that would exist on a transparent plane in front of the camera and give the audience a degree of relief from the close-up camera work. But despite all this, as we mentioned earlier, there were still a lot of risks involved in doing these shots. So if they were going to do this, the VFX artists at The Orphanage, the studio who now had the responsibility to build this HUD, were going to have to very carefully design this HUD and methodically build it in a way where they'd not only deter the audience, but instead draw them in. And with this in mind, this is where the design process of the HUD could really begin. Now, they realised early on that what they were building here was more than just a typical visual effect. This HUD they were developing was basically a piece of hardware. This was supposed to be a device which allowed for human and computer interaction, which has the purpose of allowing its user to connect to flight and weapon systems inside of the Iron Man suit. And therefore, to keep the effect realistic and believable, it had to logically operate as such. So, the first thing the VFX artists wanted to nail down was the HUD's layout, because this would set the baseline of several aspects of how this piece of hardware would function. And therefore, the VFX artists set off concepting different HUD designs. And, like all good VFX, they looked to the real world and tried to see if there were any actual HUDs they could reference as the guiding philosophy for Tony's HUD. But with Tony's tech being so advanced and 2007's HUD technology being so underdeveloped, there wasn't really much they could look to in the real world. The only examples they could really find were the HUDs in military jet fighters, where in the windows of their cockpits, the jet fighters have a HUD for the pilots to utilise. And this can be seen manifesting itself in a few scenes in the movie,
particularly where Tony is learning to fly and is using the HUD's instruments to do so.
But these jet fighter HUDs did have a limitation. Rather than being a cool and futuristic piece of technology, these HUDs were instead a very rudimentary and military-grade piece of hardware, and therefore they weren't really a good reference when you're trying to make something with the flash and flare that Tony would design. And more so than this is that these jet fighter HUDs were completely static and they didn't move, which imposed a hard limit on the amount of information they could portray on the screen, because when the screens were full, they were full. So there was no way that lots of information could be portrayed on these jet fighter HUDs. And this really wasn't what the VFX artists wanted from Tony's HUD.
With Tony being an inventor,
they wanted him to have access to as much information as possible, because they knew he's the kind of guy who's going to be obsessively monitoring and refining his suit. And because of this, a character like Tony is going to want to see every byte of data he possibly can. And so this presented a bit of an issue for the artists,
because in order to characterize Tony like this, they needed to cram as much information onto this HUD as possible.
But at the same time, they had to make sure that there wasn't so much data on the screen that it would obscure Tony behind it. Because if you can't see Tony, then that would defeat the entire point of these HUD shots. So they set off to find another reference, one which could better direct the overall layout of the HUD. And eventually they settled on the desktop of a computer, referencing the dock at the bottom of the screen and building a complicated widget system that would sit in this dock. And it was this widget system that was the key to creating a successful layout, because by using this system, they could believably compress mass amounts of data into these small widgets, which, at a simple command from Tony, could then expand and deliver set amounts of vast information to him. And these widgets were brilliant because they enabled a really natural and stylish way to keep the clutter balanced out inside of the HUD, letting Tony have access to the vast arrays of data he needed, but only what was relevant to him there and then. So computers perfectly provided the reference point for the HUD's general layout, and the widget system controlled how large amounts of data could be shifted around with ease. But as for the rest of the HUD's design, the VFX artists were still struggling to nail things down. The entire behind-the-scenes production of Ironman was infamously chaotic and unguided, and this inevitably spilled out into the production of the HUD, causing miscommunication between departments, conflicting feedback, and even going as far as making it so that the VFX artists couldn't even get access to the script or to the edit of the film they were trying to make the VFX for. And this meant that they could come up with all these cool ideas and cool concepts of different features and parts of the HUD, for example, having a mouse cursor for his eyes. But there was no overarching guidance to bind all of their designs together. So this just left them spinning their wheels for months, iterating through a bunch of different designs, but never reaching that one design that they knew was right. And so for a long time, it was just absolute chaos building this thing, until finally, midway through the film's production, a revolutionary piece of technology came out. One which would provide the guiding vision for the entire HUD, tie all of its elements together, and finally set the VFX artists on the right track. And that was, in 2007, the release of the iPhone. When post-production for this film was going on, the iPhone had just come out, and the film's director, Jon Favreau, and his VFX team could immediately see the value of this device. Because despite being a piece of future tech itself, the iPhone didn't overtly feel like it. It wasn't bloated with flair and style and flashy transitions, and it wasn't in your face or showing off. To put it simply, it wasn't acting like it was special. It just was. And this is exactly the tone that they wanted to capture in Tony's HUD. They wanted to mimic the iPhone's smooth interface, its simple transitions, and its lightweight design. Essentially, they wanted to change up the entire HUD to be user-friendly, like a real piece of hardware is. So the VFX artists went back to work and restructured everything based off the iPhone. And with this, they questioned the necessity of every single element of the HUD and asked, does someone that's flying around in this suit need this? And if they didn't, then it was gone. And with this, they could trim down the HUD to just its most important elements, particularly taking out anything that was overtly flashy or sci-fi looking, and constantly keeping in mind that this was supposed to be a functional piece of hardware made by an inventor and not some science fiction impossible thing. And thus, with the overarching design decided, they could carry their new iPhone-inspired philosophy onto their next problem. And that was, if they wanted to make this a purpose-built, user-friendly device, then they had to determine how exactly Tony could interact with his HUD, because he was the user that they wanted to make this device friendly for. So, they determined that there were three main ways that Tony could obtain information from the HUD. He could either A, verbally ask for it,
Gauge heads-up display. Check.
or B, use his eyes to activate certain parts of the HUD, or C, Jarvis could audibly tell him.
Powered reduced to 19%.
And with options A and B being the two methods that actually involved Tony, it was around these that they decided to build the most simplistic and user-friendly system possible. And therefore, they made it so that wherever Tony looked, the HUD would respond with whatever he needed, either by pulling in data from off the screen or expanding a nearby widget. And then, if Tony requested something, the HUD could completely augment itself using similar techniques in response to his request.
And this became a major behavioral driver for the HUD.
Because it could exist in one state, and then, with a simple command, widgets could expand and data could fly in, and then within seconds, it could be in a completely different state. And this led to a lot of the more iconic visuals we see throughout the film of these complicated transitions flowing from one state into another. And so, with the design of the hardware finally decided, the VFX artists could return back to their initial problem, and that was to get this thing looking good on camera, and therefore not make it look jarring to the audience. Because whilst everything we've discussed so far certainly makes it more believable as a grounded piece of hardware, there's one final step that the VFX artist took that's transported this effect from an amateur level one to something truly professional grade, and that was to, at all times, imply depth with this HUD. Because when we see Tony in these in-helmet shots, he's just existing in this dark, empty void of nothingness, with the camera right in his face. And as we mentioned earlier,
This causes the shot to be very jarring for the audience.
largely because they can infer no depth from the blackness that's enveloping Tony, and it just made everything feel flat and two-dimensional. And so this is where the necessity of the HUD elements really came into play. The VFX artists knew they could somehow use this HUD to just imply that there was lots of space behind Tony that you just couldn't see because of how tight everything was. And so they built the HUD in a way where it very slightly arced around Tony's head in a three-dimensional curve, which already helped add a bit of depth to the shot. But the real trick was to make sure that the HUD's ends were just slightly outside of the camera's view. Because by doing this, the VFX artists were able to imply an arbitrary amount of space and depth inside of the helmet, as the audience technically has no way of knowing how far or how deep this HUD goes. And this trick significantly reduced how tight and flat these shots felt, because the audience's brains would fill these knowledge gaps with whatever was most comfortable for them, thus making the shot feel much less jarring. Because think about it, you've never once questioned how far Tony's HUD goes. It just kind of goes as far as whatever feels right to you. Therefore, that's a brilliant way of relaxing your brain when looking at something that should be jarring. And so, with all of the elements of the HUD finally established, and also now having it work nicely on camera, the VFX artist could finally focus on making the HUD be tied in properly to the narrative of the film. Because you got to remember that, despite this being a piece of hardware, it's still part of a movie, and the audience spends a surprising amount of screen time staring at it, and therefore it should serve the narrative in the same way that all other props on screen do. So, to manifest this, the VFX artist added several elements of visual storytelling to the HUD. And the first of those was something very in line with the workings and the methodology of Tony himself. And that was to have the HUD evolve across the course of the movie. Because being an inventor and a tweaker, Tony wouldn't just stop after designing his first HUD. This HUD would keep evolving as he used it,
And over time, it would develop into a more refined piece of hardware, one which would better suit his needs.
and this can be seen in the two different Ironman HUDs we see in the movie. The Mark II HUD, the cyan blue one we first see, and the Mark III HUD, the red and white one we see in Tony's third Iron Man suit of the film. In the previous section, we kind of already discussed the Mark II HUD. This was the one set up more like a computer, and it was purposefully designed to be very busy with lots of detail and numbers flying in and out of the screen, so Tony could learn as much as possible about his new Iron Man suit. But the VFX artist felt that after his initial test runs, and once he knows which data he does and doesn't want to see, Tony would be able to trim this HUD down and evolve it into a sleeker and more efficient second iteration. And that second iteration took the form of the Mark III HUD. This new HUD took all the separate elements of the Mark II HUD and compiled them down into a single widget, which the VFX artist called the Omega widget. This Omega widget was based on the design of an iPod of the time, the iPod we now call the iPod Classic, and it referenced the iPod's single control ring that you used to navigate all the functions of the device. So to access its functions, Tony could expand out this Omega widget in a fashion based on a keyhole, where a command from Tony would be the key that was metaphorically entered into the keyhole, which would then turn, unlock, and fan out to release a sub-widget. And then when the task was complete, the entire Omega widget would collapse back on itself and be ready for the next task. And what I like about this is that the VFX artist chose this design because it's the natural progression of Tony's technological evolution. This new Omega widget was quicker and more efficient than the Mark II's multi-widget design, because being a self-contained unit meant that everything was very close together, and therefore it required significantly less eye movement to access each area. And by compiling the data off to the side, it meant that there were significantly less things to obscure Tony's vision than there was on the Mark II HUD, because now all the data was contained off to the side in one small location. And this made it so that the Mark III HUD was both faster to use and more space efficient, whilst also being able to present the exact same amount of data to Tony. Which is just brilliant, because this is the logical way to streamline a piece of tech that's driven by eye movement. And what's really fun about this is you can see that the VFX artists were genuinely referencing the progression of real-world technology back in 2007.
It's sort of like an iPod, sort of like a DVD player.
Because back then, if you looked at the technology of the time, progressing from a traditional computer desktop with the Mark II to the compact, intuitive ring of the iPod Classic with the Mark III seems like a very logical step. Computers required a mouse and a keyboard and far more human interaction to get from point A to point B, whereas iPods had this very modern and efficient design where you could quickly dive in,
Choose a song, and then dive out again.
so of course the iPod was the go-to choice for the technological progression of a user interface. And it's funny to look back on this now, knowing that it's actually computers who maintain their longevity, while it's the iPod who's died out. And now this brings us on to another method that the VFX artist used to tie the HUD more into the story. And that was that in every appearance of the HUD, there should always be a story moment. And these story moments were subtle ways that the HUD could either be influenced by or react to the events of the story. So, for example, when Tony first boots up the Ironman Mark II suit in his garage, the HUD is in analysis mode and is running a scan of everything surrounding Tony. But then, at a request from Tony, the HUD changes into flight mode and rapidly transforms from the analysis HUD into the flight HUD. Or another example of this is when Tony's suit takes damage, they would add a subtle lag to the HUD to show that it was under stress.
And so, whilst these story moments often weren't that obvious,
They were purposely added to emphasize a plot point or reinforce the subtext of the scene. In fact, the VFX artists have gone as far as saying that every single HUD shot in the movie has a story moment, which are like Easter eggs which are up to the audience to find. So if you guys can see any of these story moments in any of the scenes, then let everyone know in the comments, because it'd be really cool to know which each of them is. But yeah, in adding these story moments, they added a massive level of depth to the HUD, as now it's littered with tiny little things that you don't even notice on your second or third or fourth or even fifth watch through, which not only gives it massive rewatchability, but also adds an underbelly of life to the entire effect. And this is something that Jon Favreau actually stressed throughout the production of the HUD, that this isn't actually just some prop they were designing. This is essentially an entire character. This is the actor, Paul Bettany, playing the AI Jarvis, who's embodied inside of Tony's helmet as his HUD. And therefore, the HUD needs to have a sense of life to it, one beyond a piece of hardware. And I think this really manifests itself here in these story moments, with Jarvis interpreting the events of the story and then giving what he thinks is the relevant information to Tony.
Sir, it appears that his suit can fly.
And now, having discussed all these different jigsaw pieces that came together to form this HUD, we can finally take a look at the longevity of all of this. Because, as we all know, these HUD shots didn't just have an existence isolated to this one movie. It had an evolving presence across every single Iron Man appearance in the MCU. And what's incredible with this is that pretty much everything we've discussed in this video remained present throughout these appearances.
For example,
We can still always see Tony's technology and his HUD progressing. There's still always a story moment whenever the HUD's on screen. There's still lots of data being compressed via a widget system. There's still a subtle level of depth being implied, and we can still often see a computer dog in a lot of these HUD appearances. And that's just a few examples, of which I'm sure there's far more of. And it just goes to show how much thought went into this first HUD appearance, that the logic behind it remained consistent for all this time. And what's even more impressive is that they technically didn't have to do any of this. They didn't necessarily have to have all this logic and thought and craft and lore and storytelling behind the HUD's design and functionality. The HUD could have very well have been just some utilitarian thing in the movie that they used to show Tony's face inside of the suit. But instead, they gave us this awesome design that was so fantastic that it had complete longevity across the MCU's entire runtime. And this is something that shouldn't be understated, especially when you hear about how hard this thing was to make in our final section. Because aside from how much thought and care and love went into all the visual and narrative aspects of this HUD, what makes it even more impressive was how hard it was for the VFX artists to make this thing. Because despite this now being one of the most popular VFX out there, with kids in their bedrooms making their own Iron Man HUDs, according to the VFX artists, this HUD was one of the hardest things to make in the entire film. Not only because all these elements had to fly in very fast and at the same time portray a tremendous amount of storytelling, but also because at the time, VFX software just simply wasn't designed to keep up with the demands of this HUD. Why? Well, because this was something completely new in the filmmaking world. No one had ever done a VFX like this before, which meant that the software of 2007 just was not well equipped to deal with it, primarily because it fell into neither of the two major categories used in VFX work. So when making VFX, you have two major categories that you work with. You typically have the 3D side of things, where you build shapes out of 3D geometry, add animation and effects to those shapes, and then render them out as a flat image ready to be manipulated. And this tends to be known as making CGI, or computer-generated imagery. And then you have the 2D side of things, and this is where you manipulate those renders and blend them together using a lot of video Photoshop style techniques. And this is more commonly known as visual effects or compositing. But Tony's HUD fell into neither of these camps, because the HUD was essentially 2.5D. It was a bunch of 2D planes that had to fly around in three-dimensional space. So it wasn't a full 3D object like most CGI, but it also wasn't fully 2D like most compositing work. So it just sat in this weird middle ground in which none of the major VFX software was properly equipped to deal with, which meant that in order to pull this off, the VFX artists were going to have to really bend the limits of the software they had on hand, causing a constant uphill battle where simple things like just managing the computer's RAM became a very troublesome process. Or because of these abnormal demands, it would sometimes take 48 hours just to render one frame of the HUD. And these must have been massive issues, because in a film that has VFX as stunning as Iron Man's, having these great visuals of him flying around and getting into brawls in the middle of a city, to hear that these seemingly simple HUD shots were some of the most troublesome shots in the entire film, and the ones which had the artists staying up and working on them until 3 a.m, exposes just how nightmarish they must have been to pull off. But at the end of the day, it does look fantastic, and it has stayed timeless for all these years, and it did have all this influence over the next 15-20 years of filmmaking. Now, does this justify people working on it until 3 a.m? No, but it goes to show how much work and passion and effort goes on behind the scenes to make visual effects of this caliber. And moreover, speaking of timelessness, the reason kids in their bedrooms can make this stuff nowadays is because of the revolutionary nature and the popularity of these HUD effects, which caused these 2.5D techniques to sort of slowly branch their way out of Hollywood and into the more commonly used home VFX software. So not only did the HUD affect the next 20 years of the MCU, but also it affected the next generation of VFX artists too. And as someone who grew up watching Iron Man and then subsequently got into professional VFX, I too was personally influenced by Iron Man's HUD, and I might not be sat here today making this video if it wasn't for the work of the VFX artists at the orphanage back in 2007, which is pretty crazy to think about. And now this brings us to the end of the video. Thanks for watching, guys. I really hope you enjoyed this. I had a great time making this video because I truly had no idea how much work went into these HUD shots, and it was such an interesting iceberg to uncover. And I just want to give a huge shout out to the website VFX blog for researching most of this information. If you like this video and want to know even more about Tony's HUD, I've linked their brilliant article and a few other of my sources I used for this video down in the description. And speaking of this, if you guys are into VFX, then please consider checking out some of the other videos on this channel, where we dive into other films and see how the VFX artists pulled off the crazy feats in those movies. But otherwise, yeah, have a great day.